My name is Calvin Fong, and I am your moderator for tonight. This is actually a joint meeting with the Bay Area Chinese Genealogy Group, as well as the Chinese Historical and Cultural Project. Now, if you want to find out a little bit more details of our organization, you can always go to our website, and you see the logo behind me here, our website, and it's at bacgg.org. And the Chinese Historical uh, and Cultural Project is chcp.org. So if you want more details, you can always go to that. Before I introduce Dr. Ron Lee, who's our speaker tonight, and it's a very interesting topic called Sojourners to Juxing, and he will explain what that means in his presentation. But let's do a little housekeeping first. Make sure the first thing you need to do is make sure that on your Zoom screen that your audio and your camera is muted. Okay, on my Zoom screen, it's on the lower left-hand corner. Yours might be a little bit different depending on whether you're using your phone or a laptop, desktop, or a tablet. So please mute the audio and also mute the camera. If you can't find that on your Zoom screen, you can always turn down the volume. For example, if you're using a phone to watch this, you can always turn down the volume. Um, as far as the the speakers, if you go to the top of your screen, on my screen, on the Zoom screen, there's a view button there. And if you click on the view button, there's a menu, a drop-down menu that you will see, and you will see the word speaker. So we recommend that you click on the speaker. Also, if you go further down the menu, you'll see another term that says hide non-video participants. And if you would click on that, we would appreciate that as well. As far as Q&As, what we're going to do is use the chat box. And if you have any questions or comments for Ron, please type them in the chat box, which is on your Zoom screen, at the bottom of the screen, probably toward the middle of the screen. On my screen, it's next to the participant screen and the I think reset, I believe, or react. So there's a chat box there. Please type in your comments or questions that you might have for Ron. Also, the meeting is being recorded. One announcement that I would like to make is that our group, the Bay Area Chinese Genealogy Group, is looking for a webmaster. And if there are any volunteers out there who would like to do that, we would appreciate your help. Okay, let me introduce Ron now. Now, I've known Ron and his wife, Lucretia, for many decades, actually. And well, we met each other in college. And when we graduated, we just kind of lost touch of each other until very recently. In fact, last year when we saw each other at a mutual friend's birthday party. And that's where we reconnected. And that's when he told me that he actually wrote a book. And the book is based on his mother's memoirs called Sojourner to Juxing. And as I mentioned, he will explain that as we go along. Now, Ron is a fifth generation native San Franciscan, wow, who was born and raised in San Francisco, Chinatown. His daughters, of course, then are sixth generation, and they still live in the family compound in the Richmond district. Ron graduated, as I mentioned, well, first from the San Francisco public school system and then attended UC Berkeley, and that's where we met. After graduation, he and Lucretia moved down to LA where he went to graduate school. And after that, they kind of got homesick and were ready to come back to the Bay Area. And that's when they settled in San Mateo for 50 years, as I understand. And then he finally moved down to Palo Alto, where Lucretia grew up. They have two daughters, Meredith, also a Berkeley grad from the Haas School of Business, and Allison, who is a UC Santa Cruz graduate. So a very smart family. Ron and Lucretia finally settled uh, as teachers, and Lennie Lee, which is Ron's mother, had a similar careers as real estate investors and public school teachers. Now, in her spare time, she wrote extensively an autobiography and memoir that included detailed observations of life in San Francisco's Chinatown beyond the facade of tourism. At his mom's request, he was directed, along with his daughters and nephews, to edit and add to the book. The result is an extraordinary adventure and a description of the entire Chinese diaspora. Ron now spends his free time advocating for a variety of issues involving Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Ron Lee. Ron, you're on the spotlight.
Okay. Good evening. I'm going to be sharing a screen here for you. Uh, Thank you for participating. I would like to discuss a book that I wrote in conjunction with my mom. Here's a cover. It's called Sojourners, The Joke Sings. Thanks to the BACGG, the Bay Area Chinese Genealogy Group, and the CHCP, the Chinese Historical and Cultural Project, for arranging this. Also, I want to thank several individuals. We don't have time to name them, but a lot of people from these two organizations put in a lot of work, and I appreciate that greatly. As mentioned, the book title is Sojourners, The Joke Sings. I rather suspect that this group is fairly knowledgeable about Chinese American history, and you would be familiar with the term sojourners to joke sings, or sojourners rather. Those would be immigrants who come to Gumsan, the Gold Mountain, in the hopes of making some money, maybe even a fortune, but always with an obligation to return to their home village. If they should perish, then an arrangement needed to be made for their remains to be repatriated to their native village. Joke sings needs a little bit of an explanation. I think the more common term would be joke sing, Jook. But Lennie, my mom, in her writing, used this particular spelling, Joke. I'm not sure why she did that. It may be a dialectic thing. She spoke a kind of a peasant dialect, and when she spelled it phonetically, she came up with this particular spelling. As mentioned, Lennie and I both had careers in education. Lennie taught at Lowell High School, taught science at Lowell High School, and spent time as a counselor as well. Then she subsequently transferred to Galileo High School, where she taught for several years. I taught at a variety of school districts in and around the Bay Area and some for a while in Los Angeles. I also did some work as a curriculum developer for a major textbook publisher. And then for the California State Board of Education, I worked on a committee that evaluated textbooks to see if they were giving accurate or balanced portrayals of the minorities. Lenny was the genealogist, historian of our family. Um, as mentioned, even as a young person, she took many, many oral histories from relatives, and more importantly, she wrote those things down. She also spent a lot of time going through Chinatown, making observations and talking to people there. Um, she made, I think, a total of 8 trips to China. I believe that maybe 5 of those were to research her genealogy. And this went back as far as the 1970s. Her first trip was really around the time President Nixon was going to China. So, Sojourners to Joke Sings is really 2 books in one. Lenny wrote this book, which is called Joke Sings. And when she wrote that book, she left a little note at the top of the page. She said, Grandma Lee's autobiography needs improvement. So I set about, and my 2 daughters set about seeing what needed to be improved in her book. Her writing was pretty complete. Really, what happened is we just added some context to things that she said, and as we did that, we came with enough to actually create a second book. So Sojourners to Joke Sings contains excerpts from Lenny's book, Joke Sings, and then our writing, which we hope will give some light to the things she talked about. Um, what I would like to do is in past presentations, my daughter Meredith would read segments uh, of Lenny's writing. And that way, we thought it was nice because her voice of the present would represent Lenny's voice from the past. So here's what Lenny wrote in her opening paragraph.
Jook Sings is a story told by an American-born grandmother for her 4 Lee grandchildren as to what life was like growing up in an old segregated Chinatown during the 1920s through 1950s, and the stories I heard from my elders.
Now I'll be jumping around a little bit, but one of the things that we wrote about is that Lenny's father, my grandfather, whose name was Chow Chong, in our readings, we felt he was the quintessential joke sing. And I'll have Meredith read Lenny's description of her father.
Chow Chong was known to be somewhat of a bilingual maverick and roustabout during his younger days. As one of the original joke sings, he loved eating hom yi fon, salted fish and rice, and roasted prime rib of beef with mashed potatoes and gravy. As a child, he wanted to cut his queue and wear Western-style clothing. His parents refused to let him cut his queue, but allowed him to wear Western-style clothing. It was still the Qing dynasty, and cutting his queue would affect his parents' business of selling dried shrimp, scallops, abalone, salted fish, tree seeds, and seedlings to China. The Chows would get into a lot of trouble or might even be beheaded by the imperial mandarins if they should sail back to China without their queues. So he waited until his parents retired back to China during the 1890s and then cut his queue. He also had a number of white friends with whom he drank and socialized with at the Barbary Coast Brewery.
As much as we thought of Chow Chong as the quintessential joke sing, it turned out he was a sojourner for a very long time too. Towards the end of the 19th century, his parents indicated a desire to return to China. to the Quang Hoi region, where they had a native village. Chow Chong, in as much as he wanted to stay in America, um, following the precepts of filial piety, arranged to sail his parents back to China, where he built a compound for them to live. He stayed there for quite a while. He married twice and fathered 4 children while he was there. However, the pull eventually, his parents eventually passed away, and the pull of being a Joksing really indicated to him that he wanted to return to America. It wasn't too much of a problem because he was native born and had citizenship papers. By then, though, he had a wife and 4 children, and endeavored to come back. Went through the Angel Island experience. Chow Chong was a member of a tong known as the Suying Tong, and that's where he housed his family while he was away. Chow Chong traveled a lot. He not only did a lot of seafaring, but he did a lot of fishing as far as Alaska. The nature of this book, I think, is very interesting. It turns out that there's a 30-year gap between the time that my mom indicated her book and when I indicated my book. And in that entire 30 years, we never talked about this book. I didn't know even until she passed away that this book actually existed. But fortunately, we had one thing in common. That one thing in common was Dr. Hertha D. Sweet Wong, who was a UC English professor at Berkeley, who not only overlooked or oversaw her writing, but 30 years later was kind enough to take a look at my writing and actually wrote the foreword to the book. I'm going to play a recording of the foreword because I think it will tell a lot about what this project was all about.
Because it was such a surprise to hear from Ron a few years ago. Let me read you the foreword. Sometime in the early 1990s, shortly after I arrived at the University of California, Berkeley's English department as an assistant professor, an older woman came to my office hours. She had noticed that I was teaching a course on autobiography and one on translating orality, obtaining, transcribing, and then translating oral narratives into written ones. She explained that she was working on her family history, a combination of stories that she had heard from her elder relatives and her own personal stories of growing up in San Francisco's Chinatown. She asked if she could audit my classes and whether I'd be willing to give her feedback on her work. My answer to both was yes. That was my first encounter with Lennie Lee, someone I came to know as a woman of tenacity and clarity. Although her auditing didn't last throughout the semester, she was too busy wanting to go off and research, we met regularly for several months over a couple of semesters. Often, she brought me the fruits of her latest research, sometimes from microfiche copies of old Chinese newspapers that I was then and now incapable of reading. She interviewed numerous relatives, recounted family stories she'd been told as a child, researched various archives in Chinatown and throughout San Francisco and elsewhere, and traveled to China many times to research her family's pre-immigration experience. A retired high school teacher, she was a scholar of intense focus and clear purpose. Not only was she intent to tell her individual story of living in Chinatown from the 1920s through the 1950s, before moving nearby where she remained to the end of her 98 years. Not even only her family stories that go back to their arrival in the 1840s, predating the gold rush, and before that, all the way back to the Ming Dynasty. But a story of the experience of her family immigrating from China to San Francisco, and of the transformative process of learning a new language and culture under shifting but unrelenting xenophobic hostility. She does not shy away from the dangers, hardships, and challenges, but she also notes moments of generosity, grace, and humor. Her stories range from accounts of terrifyingly racist atrocities, her father's and granduncle's story of the teakwood coffins being delivered to San Francisco only to be attacked by a drunken mob of white men who murdered the stowaways inside the coffins, to anecdotes of adventure narratives in which Lennie's ancestors' seafaring stories were perhaps the inspiration for Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, to tales of Tong power struggles, the assassination of Fong Qing, known as Little Pete, to stories of the challenges of everyday life, how life was especially dangerous for Chinese girls and women. About 30 years later, I received an email from an unknown source. It turned out to be Lennie's son, Ron Lee, who had learned about his mother's work with me so long ago. I agreed happily to read various versions of the manuscript, to talk through his vision for it. And then soon after, as I was clearing out my office, I came across a manila envelope filled with newspaper articles and notes Lennie had left me. I shared these with Ron. I've enjoyed watching Lennie's project change and develop over the past few years, just as I've enjoyed getting to know Ron and Lucretia. So here it is, Lennie's project of bearing witness to pass on to her children and grandchildren, enhanced by her son and granddaughters, and now I understand nephews. When editing and shaping Lennie's stories, her son Ron, along with his daughters and nephews, offered their own research, commentary, and context. The result is a transgenerational family history that illuminates many individuals and their sets of relationships, and that highlights numerous modes of survival, for example, fishing and shrimping, cigar making, sewing, doing laundry, and generally learning to live by one's wits. Finally, despite many generational iterations of racism, Lennie and Ron's daughters shed light on Chinese immigrant and Chinese American citizen resiliency and endurance, helping us to rethink the history of Chinese Americans, from those who came with a plan to earn money and return to China, to those who remain to become Americans, from sojourners to joksings.
Well, what I'd like to do now is just introduce a few topics that were covered by myself and my mother. And I'll start by reading a segment from the book showing this particular picture. Uncle Ron, take a look at what Grandma wrote. It reads like something out of Warrior. I asked my nephew Eric, what's Warrior? And he indicated to me that it was a streamed television show, still available on Netflix, and based on a 8-page treatment that actor and martial artist Bruce Lee had written way back in the 1970s. I was intrigued, and I decided that I would look at parts of the series. And what I found was programs that presented what you would expect, some Hollywood type producers producing a storyboard from Bruce Lee's work. However, one of the things that was a revelation to me was that the action sequences in Warrior, in my opinion, didn't compare to the action sequences that my mom wrote about and that my forebears experienced. I wrote about this in a bit in a section of the book, which I call Bruce Lee versus Grandma Lee. I'm going to have Meredith read one of the stories that Grandma told, and I think you'll see that my forebears led a pretty action-packed life.
My father, Chow Chong, told me that he had just returned from Kwanhong Seaport, Hoisan, Taishan County, Canton, Guangdong Province, China, with a load of carved teakwood coffins my granduncle Ning Choi Tan had ordered for Chinatown funeral parlors and for those who wanted the bodies of their deceased sent back to China. My father and granduncle Choi Tan were already on the wharf getting their horse and cart ready to load the coffins in which they had hidden Chinese stowaways before the ship had docked. Unemployed white unionists, aroused by rumors that the returning Chinese seamen had again brought stowaways, slaughtered them in their coffins. To make an example of them, the drunken whites nailed the coffins tightly shut. Then they hammered extra long railroad spikes through the top of the coffins down into the bodies of the stowaways. The white killers continued to drinking and celebrating as they listened to the dying Chinese scream and thrash about. The murderous rampage ended with the whites beating up the Chinese seamen still on board. A number of them were thrown into the San Francisco Bay. My father and granduncle escaped during the rampage as they were on the wharf getting their horse and cart ready to pick up the coffins.
One of the things and how my book became expanded and then became a book on its own was hints that I got from reading Lennie's work. For instance, she mentioned that they had sailed their Chinese junk from Guangdong, China to San Francisco. But it'll turn out that that's not a direct route to sail. It involves actually, from my calculation, a voyage of up to 20,000 land miles to sail around what is known as the Pacific Rim in order to accomplish this move. Now, Lennie mentioned that in her writing, four different voyages. So that would be 80,000 miles of voyaging. And I rather suspect that they went further than that. Another thing they did was they routinely sailed between San Francisco and Pacific Grove, where there was a large Chinese village. Lennie mentioned, too, in just a couple of sentences, that one of her forebears was a warrior who became a sailor, a Marine, and sailed with a large fleet commanded by a very famous, but perhaps not as well known, Admiral Zheng He. And he was responsible for quite a few adventures on his own. Another interesting story that came up involved famed author Robert Louis Stevenson. Stevenson spent a few months in San Francisco near Portsmouth Square. He visited there daily in the latter part of 1879 and the early part of 1880. There, he befriended this young Chinese teenager by the name of Chow Chong. And Chow Chong, of course, was very loquacious, showed Robert Louis Stevenson around Chinatown, but equally important, he got his uncles to sail Stevenson on their junk on one of their trips to, or actually on a couple of their trips down to Monterey. Lennie wrote a bit about this when she wrote about how her older brother, named George, took Lennie to visit an elderly gentleman who turned out to have been a sailor for Chong.
Decided to give me a guided tour. A younger teenager named Sun was whom George had met at the Chinatown YMCA on Sacramento Street joined us. Sun introduced us to his grandfather, Soon Lee. Soon Lee said he once worked for Ning Fuk Ting. She recalled his words, "My first job in the United States was as a Dil Ha Loyab shrimper man for your relative Ning Fuk Ting. I sailed up and down the California coast with him for more than 10 years. I also met Robert Louis Stevenson, the writer. He rode on our Chinese junk ships to Monterey Bay a couple of times." George decided to give
So Stevenson visited the village in Pacific Grove and even wrote a description of what he saw, which was very interesting. Along the way, they made a stop at a place called China Beach in San Francisco, which is located on the northern tip of the San Francisco Peninsula and has what is obviously one of the nicest views of San Francisco. There's an interesting story about this beach, though, and how it got its name. There's a monument there that a family had erected that commemorated the Chinese fishermen in the area who camped there and at China Beach and then proceeded to fish the bay. The only problem is that California state laws were passed barring Chinese fishermen from fishing anywhere near the area that you see in this picture. It's nice that they commemorated the fishing industry, but obviously there would be a price to be paid if Chinese boats, sampans, fishing boats, would venture into the bay. On the other hand, observers routinely saw a couple of large ocean-going junks anchoring at this cove, and pretty routinely, in fact, over a period of about 50 years. The locals then became to call it China Beach because they could see these large junks which were stopping there. However, the reason they were stopping there was a little bit different. My forebears were in the funeral business. What they would do is they would take deceased sojourners, bury them for a period of anywhere between 7 and 10 years, put up markers, and then when the time came, they would exhume the bodies and repatriate them to their home village. They only did this for the Quang Oi region, which is where my ancestors were from. They buried remains in a cemetery, which is now the location of the Lincoln Park Golf Course. And so what my forebears were doing was routinely stopping at China Beach, hiking up to the cemetery, exhuming remains to be repatriated to China. Robert Louis Stevenson watched this activity and was quite curious about it. Now, my ancestors did not necessarily bury and repatriate bodies from the San Francisco area. In fact, in the city of, or the town of Tombstone, Arizona. They routinely traveled there because there was a sort of branch of the Suying Tong and took care of bodies of people that had um, perished there. Times were tough in the 1870s and 1880s. There was not very much money to go around. So paying for these services was quite a problem. Interestingly enough, the members of the town of Tombstone and with my uncles in Chao Chong came up with an interesting method of payment. Arizona, in its desert regions, was full of rattlesnakes. And what Chao Chong and his uncle did was they agreed with the residents of Tombstone, Arizona, that they would take rattlesnakes in exchange for payment. One of the catches was traditionally the rattlesnake had to be alive. And when they got back to San Francisco, they made a potion similar to what you see here. And the potion was supposedly a way to have good health. Now, there were more joke sings than just my family. And I came across one of them when I went to Pacific Grove. I came across a family who had a very interesting story being told by this woman that you see in the picture, Jerry Lo Sabado. Um, Her ancestors, about the same time, a little bit after, um, sailed from China and eventually ended up in the Monterey area. It was quite a story for them. Now, these folks were just, Jerry's ancestors were just fishermen, used to plying the shallow waters around their native village. But everybody there was aware of something called the Kuroshio Current, which is a current that ran clockwise through the Pacific Rim. So Jerry's ancestors, along with 6 other families, decided that they would take their uh, small little sampans, which were about 30 feet long, get on the Kuroshio Current and hope to float all the way to America. Of the 5 that started out, only 2 survived. The others shipwrecked and died. Jerry's ancestors landed in Monterey, and then another fellow by the name of Chong Sung shipwrecked, but fortunately on a beach in Mendocino. And to this day, there is a Chinese settlement in that town. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Lennie really enjoyed studying life in Chinatown, not only just her own history, but just life in general. From a very early age, she would routinely go through the streets of Chinatown or through the Suying Tong building and make observations and later on write of her experiences. Um, so what this book contains is a very interesting memoir about what life was like in Chinatown during the 20s through the 50s. She went and visited laundries. This gentleman, Mian Situ, is a very famous painter. He's based in Southern California, um, who painted a very famous painting called The Chinese Family Laundry. And Mian Situ was kind enough to allow me to use this image in the book. And I like it because it depicts a Chinese family working in the laundry business.
During one hot summer day in the 1940s, I recall standing in front of a basement laundry with narrow stairways which led to Sacramento Street, and watched the amazement of how the Yi Sang Gu Bok, sweating with their shirts off, scurried all over the place to wash hotel sheets in the hot, steamy, chlorinated water which smelled from the street. All the while, ironing the sheets on two 8 feet long, 3 foot diameter revolving hot drums. A few yards away, I saw several Yi Sang Gun Mo who were giving the finishing touches to the clean sheets. They used an 8 by 18-inch white cardboard to fold and shape the sheets evenly by hand. The Yi Sang Gun Mo were all wearing open collar, flowered pattern cotton shirts with short sleeves. They also wore loose 3/4 length dark pants and clogs without socks, displaying someone who could be a strong-willed Si Hao Pa.
One of the most famous and beautiful Chinese women was, of course, Anna May Wong. And the only point I'm making here is that as a youngster, she worked in a Chinese laundry in Los Angeles. Lennie also wrote about the cigar making business and what went on in the factories. He had some humorous things to discuss about how workers were enjoined from taking cigars out of the factory. She spent probably most of her time in sewing factories, where she began working at an early age, probably about at the age of 6. And of course, in town, there were merchants, and pretty common because it was one of the ways to deal with the Chinese Exclusion Act. One of the things I discovered was that many merchants, such as the owner of this store, Sing Chong store, were instrumental in allowing workers to remain in America by being able to claim that they too were merchants. There were other businesses as well. Here's a picture from the Chinese Telephone Exchange, circa 1897. Another fact of Chinatown life, I would suspect many of you are familiar with, is that as much as I say that I am a 5th generation San Franciscan and Meredith a 6th generation, my father, in fact, was a paper son. So here's a copy of his application to be admitted to the United States. And the person on the right was not his actual father, but claiming to be his father. And they were admitted after a long process. One of the things Lennie wrote about, which maybe you don't hear as much about in historical treatises about Chinatown, was the multicultural nature of the area. Here's a picture of an African-American family observing the 1906 earthquake and the devastation that would occur. They are standing at the intersection of Joyce Street and Clay Street. So they lived right there. And today, the Chinese Historical Society of America is located at that intersection. My final story is another joke sing story. This is a picture of Lennie, and she led a quite interesting life. As a youngster, at about 6 years old, actually, I'm sorry, about 8 years old, her mother encountered some financial difficulties. She got involved with a loan shark. Father Chow Chong was away seafaring, and demands began to be made on Lennie's mother to repay what was actually a bogus loan. how her mom endeavored to repay this loan was to sell Lenny to a family, a Caucasian family located at the top of Nob Hill. Um, Lenny refused to go. And to the consternation of her mother, my grandmother, they hardly spoke to each other for a period of a number of years. But this picture, showing Lenny at the age of 16, indicates, signifies a major change in her life. Lenny became a hostess at the 1939 Golden Gate International Exhibition. She began just by wearing exotic dresses and costumes, handing out favors, and started to receive tips. But as luck would have it, it became evident that she was one of the few, perhaps the only, young woman who spoke English well. So she began to not only hand out favors, but give tours. And she made actually quite a bit of money from tips, which she was able to share with my grandmother. And it did something else too. It gave Lenny a level of confidence and um, a way of looking towards the future. And as I said, she eventually went back to school, became a school teacher, but she also became a prosperous real estate investor. Well, here's Lenny with my dad, Harry, and I'm dedicating the book to them. Um, I think of them as a quintessential Joksing family. And that's the book. If there's any interest in purchasing that book, it is available as a benefit to the CHCP, the Chinese Historical and Cultural Project. What one can do is go to this URL. I think they'll have it posted on their website as well. And from there will be a special button that you can use to purchase a copy of the book. And a portion of the proceeds from the sale, it'll be about $15, will go to the CHCP. So thank you very much. That's my talk. And let me know if there are any questions.
Yeah, hi everyone. Um, there's 51 participants right now, and I'm sure you do have questions in the chat box. I don't see any questions or comments for Ron other than will his recording be available? And as Ron mentioned, or as I mentioned earlier, it will eventually be available. Certainly on our BACGG website, but that would be maybe a few weeks later. Um, I don't know if it's will be available anywhere else. I'm not sure if it's going to be posted on YouTube or whatever. But if there are any questions for Ron or comments, just please type them in the chat box. Let's see, I'll take a look at it now. And there's just one comment, Ron, that says, thanks very much for a very interesting presentation. And I would agree with that. It's quite interesting. It seems like your mom had a very interesting life living in San Francisco Chinatown. Uh, when did your mom start writing her memoirs, and how long did it take?
Well, that's an interesting question, Calvin. For instance, one of the segments that she wrote in her book, which I didn't include in this talk, was that when she was about 5 or 6 years old, living in the Suying Tong building, which is on Grant Avenue, um, she wandered into an opium den, which was on an upper floor of this Tong building. And uh, she didn't write one at the time, but it must have had a exceptional recall because she wrote in detail describing the scene of this opium den. And that was very interesting. It actually started my daughter and myself on a journey to not try to verify what she wrote, but we said to ourselves, boy, Grandma had a great memory. And so we decided we would start checking things. There's no there's no documentation for many of the things she wrote. For instance, there isn't documentation that Chow Chong and Robert Louis Stevenson were indeed friends. But the timeline and everything that Stevenson wrote about seemed to fit. And so I believe that the Stevenson event occurred along with some other things. And maybe the final arbiter of this is that Professor Wong specialized in what she called orality. And in conversations with her, she never once doubted the stories that Lennie wrote.
Yeah, that's interesting about Robert Stevenson and how he went back to China several times. And did he write anything about his adventures going back to China or the things that he saw?
Well, he didn't actually go to China. He
Oh,
sailed with my forebears to the fishing village at
mm,
Monterey. He
okay.
didn't name anybody per se. What he did write was that sitting in Portsmouth Square, he made friends with some people who were what he called vagabonds of the sea. He didn't name my grandfather or my great granduncles by name. Um, the story seems to fit pretty well, so I'm willing to write this. There's an I'll mention an interesting fact. This is clearly a memoir, and at one point I wrote a an op-ed about Robert Louis Stevenson to the San Francisco Chronicle. There's an ongoing controversy about the Robert Louis Stevenson Memorial that's in um, Portsmouth Square, and there's a movement afoot to have that statue removed. And the reason given is that ostensibly he had nothing to do with the Chinese. Now, what makes this story interesting is so I write an op-ed, which is published in the Chronicle, but it's clearly my opinion, an opinion piece, but which is interesting. But however, if you go to Google AI, for some reason, Google AI, has taken that article and take it as something that was written um, as a historical fact. So what'll happen is if you go to Google and ask it who was Robert Louis Stevenson's Chinese friend, it'll say, "Oh, it was this guy Chow Chong who took him sailing and they hung out together." Now, I have no doubt that that's true, but on the other hand, this is entirely an opinion piece that I wrote. So um, my daughters and their partners, who are a little bit more literate about technical things, uh, gave me a new term. They said, "Oh, that's AI hallucinating." So um, it's an AI hallucination. I find that kind of humorous.
Yeah, you mentioned the China Beach, and I was quite surprised when you said it really wasn't used as a fishing village, and so which surprised me, and but it was used for more nefarious purposes, I suppose, of transporting people and perhaps what you said, bones,
Yeah.
uh, back to China. That's interesting. Okay, we do have a couple of comments. on the chat box. Here's one. Is a copy of Lennie's book available as well?
Well, what I recommend is if you go to the uh, CHCP website, uh, there's a link there where you can go to uh, purchase a book. I think after we get through this talk, I'll post a URL which you can go to. But also, there are some libraries. I know that the Palo Alto Library has some copies that you can just check out if you're interested in reading this.
Okay. Here's another comment. Aside from what Lennie wrote for her memoirs with Professor Wong's help, were there journals she referred to or other free writings Lennie used to help her write her memoirs?
Um, Interestingly enough, she had a large collection of books written by very noteworthy authors of Chinese American history. But she didn't actually quote from many of them because her approach to the diaspora was an entirely different take. The big story that most historians will write about is that there was an influx of Chinese during the gold rush era and then continued on with the building of the railroads and so forth. But Lennie's time frame is actually um, uh, as much as 10 years before that event. What I find interesting for anybody who is interested in following up as a member of the BACGG is that my mom wrote as if um, her forebears, my great uncles, weren't the only ones that were there. She seemed to imply that there was a whole village there, and that would be a surprising revelation in this area, which is called China Basin. She indicated that there were quite a few Chinese living in that area when they got there, which would have been around 1840.
Interesting. Here's another question by the same person. Excuse me. She says, great presentation, Ron. Was Dr. Wong's reading of the forward recorded from an earlier time? And are those notes and work with your mother available to other researchers to look at?
Dr. Wong's talk was given at a talk that I gave for the Palo Alto Library. Um, and if you want to contact her directly, I think you can do that through UC Berkeley.
Mhm. Okay. Who did Lennie share her book with? What were challenges in getting the second book, memoir, to final production?
Well, it was interesting. If you were here earlier, you heard Meredith read a description of why my mother wrote this book at all. And she specifically had written it to be given just to her two granddaughters and two grandsons. She wasn't actually interested, apparently, in posting it to anybody else. However, it became a kind of the evolution of a book. I took what Lennie wrote, uh, published a small, actually, it wasn't that small, published a manuscript based on her work alone and handed it out to my cousins at a celebration of life. My mom passed away in November of 2021. Um, from there, a lot of questions arose. And actually, because of the pandemic, I had a lot of time on my hands. So I did a bunch of online type research to come up with some of the stories that I have included.
You know, transporting your the bones back to China, uh, was that a very prosperous business? And how did they the people that were trying an attempt to dig up these bones and send them back to China. How do they track down the relatives back in China to do that?
Well, when the bones were buried, tombstones were put in place indicating the origin of the deceased. It turns out that my ancestors, my forebears, were only interested in returning uh, remains from their native village. They had an organization they called a Quanghoi Seamen Society, and it specifically only serviced members from the Quanghoi region. Now the six companies, etc., had a more extensive program to return remains, but that's tricky. My understanding is that in Hong Kong, there's a hospital there with thousands of remains that are unidentified. But my 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 grandfather and his relatives, they were specifically interested in actually two things. One was to take care of members from their home village, and two, it was a very expensive proposition to do this, to send bodies back to China for repatriation. It might not sound like a lot of money, but for instance, the cost to exhume a body ran from anywhere from $10 to $50 at a time when the daily wage was $1 or $2. So, you
Yeah.
know, I use this term in the book. My grandfather and my great uncles, they were scofflaws. They weren't going to pay any fees that were being charged to them by the powers that be.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like they did a decent living there. Uh, were there others that were doing something similar, as far as you know?
Not that I know of, but like I said, if you read the book, you will find that my family was they were mavericks, is the best way to describe it. For instance, I mentioned that my grandmother, who was illiterate, lost the home that they were in. Um, so how does it come to pass that my grandfather um, uh, did not make a lot of money? How did it come to pass that he bought a house on Washington Street?
Mm.
And I suppose I should tell you to go read the book to find the true story, but I'll tell you the true
I plan
story.
to.
Um, Chow Chong agreed with the leaders of the Suying Tong. Um, the main leader of the Suying Tong had been arrested for operating an opium den of all things.
Yeah.
And the leader of the Tong made a deal with my grandfather and said, okay, you take the rap, you go to jail for me, and I'll give you enough money to buy a house. So one of the things that I had to discover was that my grandfather spent 3 years in a federal penitentiary in Washington. I have the documentation of that. And when he came out, he was able to buy a house. And then if you're familiar with Chinese families, um, I have a section in the book I call a gap. And in a gap, Chow Chong had 9 children. The first 6 children, uh, just in height, went in order. And then all of a sudden, there's a gap where the next 2 children are several years younger than Lenny and her siblings. And I think that that little gap explains, or Chow Chong's time spent in prison probably explains that gap.
Yeah. Interesting, the Suyin Association. My my father also belonged to that organization as
Oh, is
well.
that right? Oh,
Yeah. That he adamantly said he was not a Tong though. That but he did belong to the same Chinese association.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. My mother insisted that Chow Chong wasn't a hatchet man, but
No.
that his main job at the Tong was that he spoke, he could read and write English, and they found that very useful.
Mhm. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. My father mentioned at one time that uh, I guess I don't know. He was a very popular herbalist in Oakland, Chinatown. And he did mention one time that uh, he needed protection. And so he had one or two hatchet men accompany him on certain journeys. So how true that is, I don't know. Or what kind of enemies he had, I don't know. But I found that interesting.
Uh, Another place we might have a connection, Calvin, is my mother married very early. She had my brother when she was 18.
Mhm.
And my mom was reluctant to tell certain stories about herself. But I suspect that she met my father, who was 16 years older than her. She might have been a hostess at one of your father's nightclubs and, and met there. That's the only reason I could think of how a bartender would meet, a young woman. Uh,
Yeah,
but he was a very loving and you know, a great father. So I
yeah.
have no complaints.
Well, that's a quite a possibility. He had a pretty popular nightclub in San Francisco called the Club Shanghai. So right on Grand Avenue. So
Yeah, my mom let it slip. She was I wouldn't say proper, but for instance, the story about my grandfather going to the penitentiary, she never told me. I just found it through the documentation. She never told me how she actually met my father, but
mhm.
I don't know. I'm thinking, okay, she's a nice looking woman dressed up nicely. My father's a bartender, 16 years older than her.
Oh,
How do they meet? So.
yeah. You mentioned your mom was at the World's Fair. Was it the
Yeah,
World?
it's actually called the Golden Gate International Exhibition, but it was like a World's Fair. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And actually, there was another bilingual Chinese that I believe was the same World's Fair, Noel Toy. She was a fan dancer, a burlesque dancer.
Oh, uh-huh.
Yeah, and she actually danced at my father's club at the Club Shanghai. So, uh, you mentioned, Ron, that you're involved with Asian Americans, the Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islander issues. And what kind of issues are you involved in?
Oh, well, we're my wife Lucretia and I are not quite that active anymore. But when we were younger, we belonged to an organization in the South Bay called ACI, Asian Americans for Community Involvement. And they were very active in advocacy issues. So we worked with them and supported that group for quite a number of years. And ACI is actually still in operation in the San Jose area.
Oh, okay. Yeah, interesting. You know,
Um,
if there are any other questions, please type them in the chat box. I do have one other question, Ron. Do you
mhm.
consider yourself a Juxing?
Um, that's a very interesting question because I think the term "juxing" started out as a pejorative and derogatory, but I think nowadays, when immigrants from everywhere arrive in America, the goal is to become a juxing. And I think that without actually having to consciously do this, um, as my family moved in what's actually I think a classic migration. They moved from Chinatown to the Richmond district, where they stayed, um, but then we moved south. Um, I think it was a natural progression of the things. Neither of us are. Neither my brother and I became fluent in Chinese, although I went to Chinese school for quite a while. And I think you can tell by listening to my daughter Meredith that, by the time you get to the sixth generation, you lose a lot of the words. It's the tone and inflection that's kind of hard. I still know a lot of Chinese, but I don't speak very much Chinese because I get tired of people laughing at me.
Me too.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm looking at the chat box. Are there any questions for Ron? I don't see any additional comments at this point. Let's see. Oh, let's see. Here's one comment. Records of traditional Chinese junk ships sailing to the Americas is not readily recorded history. How did you discover that Chinese junk ships were used for transporting bones?
That story originates from my mom. I was able to identify uh, some junks that were in excess of 100 feet long, uh, pictures of junks that were docked at a place called the Oyster Point Village. And so I know that those junks existed. I have a couple of comments from some historians, one in particular who is a oceanic archaeologist, who said that it's quite possible that those large junks existed. Also, there's a researcher by the name of Tom Bradgee who didn't describe my family's junks, but there is quite a history of Chinese junks in Southern California, in the San Diego area. And actually, um, they had ocean-going junks that came up the peninsula, and so there's a record of large junks being uh, plying the area. In fact, Professor Bradgee's comment was that the junks from San Diego would also sail as far north and actually anchored also at China Beach, but they dare not go into the bay because they would be attacked. Um,
Interesting. Yeah. You mentioned that the state of California wouldn't allow the Chinese to do fishing. Uh, they were actually allowed to fish in certain areas in San Francisco Bay. Okay. Like you said, most of the areas were prohibited in the bay and just along the coast. But there was a certain area just towards San Bruno where they were allowed to fish, and only certain times of the year. And then they were allowed to fish, let's say, from the beginning of the 19th century to about World War II. And then uh, when World War II started, the military started, of course, as you know, started building all these bases around the bay. And one was on the Oakland side. And that's where they prohibited the Chinese from fishing in that area. And that was the final demise of the Chinese fishing in San Francisco Bay.
yes, I was quite interested to hear your stories about your father being in the shrimping and fishing business.
Right.
That's something I didn't know, so that
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
quite interesting to me.
Yeah. So are there any other comments that people have? I don't see any more in the chat box. Well, we started at 6 and it's what, almost 7:30 or 7:15? So if let's see, there might be one more. Let me take a look. Okay, here's a question. What is the evolution of the term juxing? How how did it come about, and what is the literal translation?
Oh, okay, that's a good point. Joksing translates to be meaning bamboo pole or bamboo shoot.
Mhm.
And the metaphor then is that water poured into a bamboo pole does not come back out. And so the metaphor referred to uh, Chinese people, or actually anybody who came but didn't come back out.
Mm. Okay. So let me double check. I think those are all the comments that I see. So, well, thank you very much, Ron. It was a very, very interesting talk, and
Okay,
I've
thank
certainly
you.
learned a lot from it.
Thank you to the BACGG and the CHCP for the opportunity to talk about this.
Okay, yeah. So I guess that ends our meeting. So we appreciate everyone in Zoom land for joining us. And I hope you found it just as enjoyable as I did. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ron.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.